The wind whispered through the rocks like voices of the dead. In the absolute darkness of the cave, something moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something that shouldn't exist. 6.4 million years ago, when humanity was still crawling through eastern Africa, a female Homo habilis discovered that fear isn't just an emotion. It is the architect of faith itself. Her name would be forgotten by time, but what she created in those cursed nights would echo through millions of years, becoming the very foundation of every belief system that would ever exist. Tonight, you'll witness the birth of humanity's first religion, born not from love, but from pure, primal terror. The acacia thorns tore through her weathered skin as she ran, but the female Homo habilis didn't slow down. Behind her, the darkness seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of some massive, invisible beast. She had no name in the way we understand names. Her kind had only recently begun to associate specific sounds with individuals. But for our story, we'll call her Kaya. The East African savanna stretched endlessly before her, bathed in the sickly yellow light of a dying sunset. The air reeked of death, not the clean death of a successful hunt, but something else, something wrong. The scent made her primitive mind recoil, triggering instincts older than consciousness itself. Kaya's small group had been foraging near the dried riverbed when it started. First, the silence. Every creature within miles had simply stopped. No chirping insects, no rustling grass, no distant roars. Just an oppressive quiet that pressed against her eardrums like water. Then came the sounds that didn't belong to any world she knew. Thrum, thrum ... A rhythmic pulsing that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Her companion, a male she had mated with during the last dry season, had approached the sound with curiosity. That was the last time she saw him alive. The memory flashed through her primitive consciousness, his body twisted into impossible angles, eyes wide with an expression she had never seen before. Not pain, not fear, something else. Something that made her very soul want to flee from her own flesh. Now, as she stumbled through the thorny undergrowth, that same expression haunted her. Because in those final moments, she had seen something in his eyes that terrified her more than death itself. Recognition. As if he had seen something that explained everything, and that knowledge had broken him completely. The darkness behind her pulsed again, and this time, she heard it whisper her sound name, the guttural noise her group used to identify her. But the voice that spoke it wasn't from this world. Kaya's feet found familiar ground as she approached the cave system her group had sheltered in for 3 seasons. But even this sanctuary felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. And somewhere in those depths, she could hear that rhythmic thrumming growing stronger. What she didn't know was that she was about to become the first human being to create something that would outlive every empire, every species, every star in the sky. She was about to invent faith itself. But first, she had to survive the night. The cave mouth yawned before her like the maw of some primordial beast, its jagged edges silhouetted against the star-drunk sky. Kaya's chest heaved as she pressed her back against the cool limestone, her primitive lungs struggling to process the terror-thinned air. Inside the cavern, her group would be huddled around their precious fire, unaware that something fundamental about their world had changed forever. She could hear them, the soft grunts and murmurs that passed for conversation among her kind, the crackling of burning wood, the shuffle of bodies settling for the night. Normal sounds. Life sounds. But underneath it all, barely perceptible, was that otherworldly thrumming, growing stronger with each passing moment. Thrum, THRUM ... Kaya's hand shook as she gripped the crude stone tool hanging from her waist. The obsidian edge had been knapped by her own hands, shaped through countless hours of patient work. It had killed rabbits, stripped bark, defended against hyenas. But she knew with absolute certainty that it would be useless against whatever was coming. The first scream shattered the night. It came from deep within the cave, echoing off the limestone walls with a resonance that seemed to multiply the terror. But this wasn't the scream of pain or fear that Kaya knew. This was something else entirely, a sound that spoke of revelations too horrible for the mind to process. Another scream joined the first, then another. In seconds, the cave erupted in chaos as her group members fled deeper into the tunnels, their voices creating a symphony of panic that had never been heard before in the history of her species. Kaya forced herself to move, her legs trembling as she crept toward the cave entrance. What she saw inside defied every understanding her primitive brain had constructed about reality. The fire still burned, but its light seemed wrong, twisted somehow, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. And standing in the center of the cavern was a figure that shouldn't exist. It looked like one of her kind, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a Homo habilis body and reformed it according to rules that existed outside of nature. Too tall, joints bending in directions that violated the architecture of bone and sinew, and its eyes. Its eyes held the same terrible knowledge she had seen in her mate's face. The thing turned toward her, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "You see now," it said, the words somehow comprehensible, despite being in no language that had ever existed. "You understand what lies beneath the world you thought you knew." Kaya's mind recoiled from the implications of what she was witnessing. This creature, whatever it was, spoke of things beyond her comprehension. But in that moment of absolute terror, something unprecedented happened in the evolution of human consciousness. She began to believe, not in the creature itself, but in something larger, something that could create creatures like this, something that existed beyond the physical world she could touch and smell and taste. For the first time in the history of her species, a human being conceived of the supernatural. The thing smiled, revealing teeth arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. "Yes," it whispered, "now you begin to understand. Faith is born from fear, little one, and fear is the only truth that matters." The transformation had begun not in her mind, but in her very DNA as Kaya crouched at the cave entrance. Something fundamental rewired itself in the deepest structures of her brain. The neural pathways that would someday give birth to temples, prayers, and gods were forming for the first time in evolutionary history. She watched in horrified fascination as the impossible creature moved through her terrified group like a predator among prey. But it wasn't hunting for food. It was hunting for something far more precious: understanding, belief, the capacity to conceive of powers beyond the physical realm. Each member of her group that encountered the entity emerged changed. Their eyes held a new quality, a haunted awareness that hadn't existed in any primate species before. They'd been forced to expand their concept of reality to include things that couldn't be explained by instinct or experience alone. KETH ... KETH ... NNGH ... The sounds coming from her group members weren't quite language, but they carried meaning nonetheless. They were trying to communicate something that their primitive vocabulary couldn't express: the existence of realms beyond the tangible world. Kaya found herself backing deeper into the shadows as the creature's attention turned toward her. Its movements were fluid, hypnotic, like watching water flow uphill. Everything about it violated the natural laws she had spent her life learning to navigate. "You are different," it observed, tilting its malformed head at an angle that would have snapped a normal spine. "The others fear and forget, but you do remember. You hold the fear like a flame." The words penetrated her consciousness like thorns, embedding themselves in parts of her mind that had never been accessed before. She understood now that this creature hadn't come to destroy them. It had come to change them, to plant seeds in their primitive psyches that would grow into something unprecedented in the natural world: religion. The concept formed in her awareness like a sunrise, illuminating mental landscapes she had never known existed. The idea that there were forces beyond the physical world, entities that operated according to rules that transcended natural law, powers that demanded not just respect but worship. Around the dying fire, her group members had begun to arrange themselves in patterns. Not the random clustering of frightened animals, but deliberate formations that somehow felt sacred. They were creating the world's first ritual, driven by instincts they didn't understand and couldn't resist. The creature watched their movements with satisfaction, its terrible eyes reflecting the firelight like black mirrors. "Yes," it hissed. "This is how it begins. Not with love or joy, but with terror so pure it breaks open new chambers in your minds. Fear teaches you that there are powers greater than yourselves, and once you accept that truth," it gestured toward her group members, who were now swaying in unison, their voices joining in a wordless chant that seemed to resonate with frequencies beyond normal hearing. You become capable of faith. Kaya watched her people transform before her eyes. They were no longer just another species of early hominids struggling to survive in a hostile world. They had become something new, beings capable of believing in the invisible, the impossible, the divine. But as she observed their ecstatic movements, a chill ran down her spine, because she realized that this gift came with a price. The same neural pathways that enabled them to conceive of gods and spirits also made them vulnerable to manipulation, control, and exploitation. They had gained the capacity for faith, but they had also become prey to any entity clever enough to exploit their newfound need for the supernatural. The creature's smile widened as if reading her thoughts. "Now you understand the true purpose of belief," it whispered. "It is not meant to comfort. It is meant to control." The revelation hit Kaya like a physical blow. As she watched her group members lose themselves in their primitive ritual, she understood with crystalline clarity that they were no longer free. The entity had done more than terrorize them. It had fundamentally altered their neural architecture, creating new needs and dependencies that hadn't existed before. They were addicted to the supernatural now. Their brains craved the acknowledgement of powers beyond themselves, the structure that belief provided, the comfort of knowing that something greater was watching over them, even if that something was malevolent. "Observe how eagerly they surrender their autonomy," the creature said, its voice now coming from multiple directions at once, as if the cave walls themselves were speaking. "This is the true genius of faith. It convinces the believers that their subjugation is actually liberation." Around the fire, her group members had begun to prostrate themselves, pressing their foreheads to the cave floor in gestures of submission that no Homo habilis had ever performed before. The movements came naturally to them now, as if they were accessing genetic memories that had somehow been implanted in their cells. Kaya's own body betrayed her as she felt the irresistible urge to join them. Every instinct screamed at her to fall to her knees, to surrender to the overwhelming presence that filled the cavern. But something deeper, a spark of defiance that would someday evolve into free will, held her upright. "Why do you resist?" the entity asked, suddenly standing directly beside her, though she hadn't seen it move. "Do you not feel the relief that comes with surrender? The peace of knowing that you are not alone in the universe?" The temptation was almost unbearable. Kaya could sense the comfort that faith would bring, the end of uncertainty, the assurance that existence had meaning and purpose. All she had to do was kneel, and the terrible weight of autonomous thought would be lifted from her shoulders forever. But as she teetered on the edge of submission, images flashed through her mind. Her mate's face in his final moments, twisted with the knowledge of his own helplessness. Her group members, reduced to automatons performing rituals they didn't understand for entities that cared nothing for their welfare. "No," she whispered, the word emerging from her throat like broken glass. The creature's expression shifted to something that might have been surprise, if such human emotions could exist on its inhuman features. "Fascinating," it murmured. "In all my eons of seeding belief systems across countless worlds, I have never encountered resistance at this stage. Fear always breaks the mind open completely. Always. And yet." It circled her slowly, its movements creating displacement patterns in the air that made her eyes water. "You retain some fragment of independent thought. How curious. How useful." Kea backed against the cave wall, her primitive mind struggling to process concepts far beyond her evolutionary programming. But somewhere in the chaos of her terror, a new understanding began to crystallize. The entity needed believers, but it also needed something else. Skeptics, questioners, beings who could see the mechanisms of control even while being subject to them. "Yes," it hissed, reading her thoughts. "You begin to understand. Faith requires doubt to define itself. Love needs hate to give it meaning. Order demands chaos to justify its existence. You will be my gift to your species, the eternal questioner, the voice that whispers doubt even as the masses bow in worship." The creature reached out with one impossible hand and touched her forehead. The contact burned like ice and fire simultaneously, searing new neural pathways into her brain with surgical precision. "You will carry this burden through the generations," it intoned. "Your descendants will question every god, challenge every belief, seek truth, even when truth brings only pain. They will be the ones who remember that faith began in terror, and that every prayer is ultimately a cry for protection from powers that care nothing for the supplicant." Kaya felt the change taking root in her consciousness, not the mindless surrender that had claimed her group, but something far more complex and terrible. The ability to see through the illusions of belief while being powerless to escape their influence entirely. She would believe, but she would always know the price of that belief. Around them, her group members continued their ecstatic worship, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to resonate with forces beyond the physical world. They had found their purpose, their meaning, their God. And in finding it, they had lost themselves completely. Dawn crept through the cave entrance like a wounded animal, its pale light struggling to penetrate the supernatural darkness that had settled over their sanctuary. Kaya remained pressed against the limestone wall, her body racked with exhaustion from her night-long vigil. The entity still moved among her group, but its form had become translucent, as if the approaching sunrise was gradually erasing it from reality. Her people lay scattered around the extinct fire, their bodies twisted in positions of supplication, their faces bearing expressions of transcendent peace that made her stomach turn. They had found something beyond themselves to worship, and the relief of that discovery had broken something fundamental in their spirits. "The work is nearly complete," the creature whispered, its voice now barely a breath of wind through the cavern. "They will carry this gift to their offspring, and their offspring's offspring, until every branch of humanity has tasted the sweet poison of belief. Wars will be fought in the name of invisible powers. Empires will rise and fall based on competing interpretations of divine will. Billions will live and die serving entities they will never see, never touch, never truly know." Kaya watched her mate's sister crawling across the cave floor, her eyes rolled back in ecstatic revelation, her lips moving in silent prayers to powers that existed beyond comprehension. The sight filled her with a grief so profound that it threatened to shatter what remained of her sanity. "Why?" she managed to croak, her throat raw from hours of suppressed screams. "Why do this to us?" The entity paused in its gradual dissolution, and for a moment, something almost like genuine emotion flickered across its impossible features. "Because consciousness is a disease," it replied. "Your species developed the ability to think, to question, to imagine possibilities beyond your immediate circumstances. This made you dangerous, not to us, but to yourselves. Left unchecked, truly free minds inevitably discover truths that destroy them. So we provide alternatives, beliefs that channel your questions into safe directions, gods that give meaning without revealing too much meaning. The morning light grew stronger, and with it, the entity became more ghostly, its edges blurring into the shadows. Faith is not the opposite of knowledge. It is knowledge's substitute, a drug that makes the unbearable weight of existence tolerable. Would you prefer that your species face reality without these comforting illusions? Would you want them to see the universe as it truly is, vast, empty, indifferent, and utterly without inherent meaning? Kaya's mind reeled as she contemplated the implications. Perhaps the entity was right. Perhaps the gift of belief, even belief born from terror, was preferable to the alternative. She looked at her group members' peaceful faces and wondered if she was the one who was truly cursed, doomed to see the mechanisms of control while being unable to enjoy the comfort they provided. Your burden is unique, the creature continued, now little more than a whisper of displaced air. You will spend your existence caught between faith and knowledge, never fully able to embrace either. Your descendants will inherit this curse. They will be the philosophers, the scientists, the revolutionaries who chip away at the foundations of belief while secretly yearning for the certainty it provides. The first rays of true sunlight penetrated the cavern, and the entity began to fade entirely. But its final words echoed with crystalline clarity. Remember this night, Kaya. Remember that every god your species ever worships was born from the same source, the terror of existing in a universe too large and complex for primitive minds to comprehend. And remember that this terror is not a flaw to be overcome, but the foundation upon which all human civilization will be built. As the last traces of the supernatural presence dissolved into the morning air, Kaya found herself alone with her transformed people. They were beginning to stir, their eyes focusing with the slow awareness of those awakening from profound dreams. But they were no longer the same species that had entered the cave the previous evening. They had become something new, beings capable of faith, worship, and the complex psychological structures that would someday give birth to every religion that would ever exist. And she had become something else entirely, the eternal questioner, forever caught between the need to believe and the knowledge of belief's true origins. The age of gods was about to begin, but it would be built on a foundation of carefully orchestrated terror that only she would remember. Months passed like fever dreams. Kaya watched her people evolve with supernatural speed, their primitive social structures transforming into something unprecedented in evolutionary history. The cave had become a temple, decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. Her group had grown as word spread through the scattered bands of early hominids. They came seeking answers to questions they had never known how to ask, drawn by stories of the night when existence itself had revealed its hidden depths. But what they found was something far more complex than simple revelation. They found the first church. The rituals had become elaborate affairs, performed with clockwork precision that belied their supposed spontaneity. Her people would gather at specific times, arrange themselves in patterns that mirrored celestial movements they couldn't possibly understand, and speak words and languages that had never been taught to them. Kaya observed it all with the detached horror of someone watching her species transform into something she could no longer recognize as her own kind. The most disturbing change was in their eyes. The wild, unpredictable spark that had characterized her people was gone, replaced by a serene certainty that made her skin crawl. They had traded the chaotic beauty of free thought for the crystalline structure of absolute faith. "We are watched," her former mate's brother would intone during the evening ceremonies, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't produce. We are guided. We are loved by powers beyond our comprehension. The words were true, but not in the way he believed. They were indeed watched by entities that viewed them as fascinating specimens in an experiment spanning millennia. They were guided toward predetermined conclusions that served purposes they would never understand. And they were loved with the affection a farmer might feel for particularly productive livestock. As the seasons turned, Kaya found herself becoming a living repository of forbidden knowledge. She alone remembered the entity's true nature, its casual admission of manipulation, its revelation that faith was a control mechanism disguised as liberation. But she also felt the irresistible pull of belief tugging at her consciousness with each passing day. The psychological pressure was immense. To resist faith required constant vigilance, an exhausting effort of will that left her isolated from her own species. She could see the peace that belief brought to her people, the sense of purpose and meaning that filled their days. Sometimes, in her weakest moments, she almost envied them their certainty. But then she would remember the thing's smile, its satisfaction as it watched autonomous beings surrender their independence for the comfort of servitude. And she would find the strength to continue her lonely vigil. One night, as she sat apart from the evening ritual, she felt a familiar presence stirring in the shadows. The entity had returned, barely perceptible but undeniably there. "How do you find your gift?" It whispered, its voice like wind through dry bones. "It's not a gift," she replied without looking up. "It's a curse. Are they not the same thing?" Every blessing carries the seeds of its own torment. Your people have found meaning, purpose, community. They face each day with confidence in their place within a greater design. Is this not preferable to the alternative? Kaya gestured toward her worshiping group, their faces illuminated by firelight as they performed their mystical pantomime. "They're not free," she said simply. "Freedom is overrated," the entity replied. "It brings only anxiety, confusion, and despair. Observe how much happier they are now that they have surrendered the burden of choice." But even as it spoke these words, Kaya detected something in its tone, a hollowness that suggested the entity itself might not entirely believe what it was saying. Perhaps it too was trapped in its role, condemned to spread the virus of belief across countless worlds without ever understanding why. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now your species begins its true journey. The capacity for faith will spread through your genetic line, mutating and evolving as your people do. Some will worship sun and moon. Others will invent invisible sky fathers and earth mothers. Eventually, they will craft elaborate mythologies to explain their existence, complete with moral codes and afterlife promises. And through it all, they will remain exactly what they became on this night, willing servants to powers they will never truly comprehend." The entity's presence began to fade, but its final words lingered in the cave air like smoke. "Your species will call this night the birth of religion. But you know the truth. It was the death of something far more precious. The death of genuine independence. Guard that knowledge well, Kaya. Someday, your descendants might need to remember what was lost." As the supernatural presence dissipated, leaving only the familiar sounds of her people's worship, Kaya understood her true purpose. She was not just a witness to humanity's transformation. She was its memory, the living record of what her species had been before it learned to kneel. Somewhere in the vast sweep of evolutionary time, her distant descendants would need to choose between the comfort of faith and the terror of genuine freedom. And when that moment came, they would carry within their genes the echo of this night, the memory of the first belief, born not from love or wonder, but from carefully orchestrated fear. The age of gods had begun with a whisper in the darkness, and only she would remember that the whisper had been a lie designed to sound like truth, delivered by entities that loved humanity enough to ensure it would never be truly free again. In the flickering firelight, her people continued their endless worship, never knowing they were celebrating the anniversary of their own spiritual enslavement. And somewhere in the shadows, ancient powers watched with satisfaction as their greatest experiment continued to unfold across the millennia. The first church had been established. The first faith had taken root. And the first questioner sat alone in the darkness, carrying the weight of truth that no one else would ever want to bear. But she would carry it nonetheless, because someone had to remember what freedom looked like before humanity learned to call its chains salvation. The night was ending, but the age of belief would last forever.